And now, David Schoenbrun.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, and fellow Americans, whatever else you may be. The state of our country being what it is, you might be just about anything. Democrats of various persuasions, Republicans of different stripes, independents, crazies, SDS, YAF, doves and hawks, hoves and dorks, owls, eagles, a vulture or two. There's generally one in every crowd. Certainly a great many chickens. I salute you all. I salute you all, and I suggest that hereinafter we stop referring to one another in ornithological terms. The only human birds I've ever known used to live in the White House. And Linda Bird and Lady Bird and all the other birds have flown the coop. I'm glad to see them go, much as I deplore their successor. As you can see, I'm completely objective. I have not approved of a Democratic or a Republican regime for many, many years. There are some people who think that it's a terrible thing to say that you don't approve of your government, and they raise questions of patriotism, and all of us have wrestled with this question. It's a fair question to try to answer. I was raised, as you have been, and all of our other fellow Americans across this country, have been raised with the general simplistic notion of Stephen Decatur, who told us, our country, right or wrong. I used to believe in that, and now I've come to believe it's really kind of silly. It's on the intellectual level of saying, my mother, drunk or sober. Well, I loved my mother very dearly, and she was not a drunk, although to make a buck we did grow bathtub gin back in the house that I was born in Harlem many, many years ago. But had my mother been a drunk, I would have loved her and put her into a sanatorium to dry her out, because that's what you do with drunks, mothers or countries. I think there's a better patriotism that Americans can answer to, and it was stated about the same time as Stephen Decatur by a very great man, Senator Carl Schurz of Missouri, who led the anti-imperialist convention in Chicago in 1899, was, of course, as you can imagine, beaten up by the police on his way to Convention Hall. Nothing's changed in Chicago this century. And Senator Schurz was objecting to the annexation of the Philippine Islands. And he said, this is nothing for Americans to do. We're not vulgar imperialists like Germans or Frenchmen or Portuguese or Spaniards or Englishmen. We're Americans. We shouldn't be annexing other countries and other peoples. And a man got up in the audience and said, Senator, you're not a good American. Remember what Stephen Decatur said, my country, right or wrong. Carl Schurz's answer is one that I've lived with ever since I first read it as a young history student many years ago. He replied, my country, right or wrong, yes, but when right, to be kept right, and when wrong, to be put right. That's what free men and women can do. It is in the spirit of Carl Schurz, as an ex-soldier in the American Army who fought for his country in a very great army and in a very great cause against Japanese militarism and the darkness of the Nazi night. It is in this spirit that I speak to you today about Vietnam and how it can be put right and why it is wrong. It's necessary to deal a little briefly with the background and the history of the Vietnamese War, because our government tells us over and over again that we are there to stop a communist aggression. That is not true. Our government tells us over and over again that we are there to support a free and democratic regime in South Vietnam. And that is not true either. And unless we know what is true and what is false, it is very difficult for us to assume a proper posture in Vietnam. If we are there for any moral reason whatsoever, if we are there in the vital interests of the United States and the security and well-being of our country and of the rest of humanity, then we ought to be there, and we ought to fight, as we did in World War II in Korea and in many other places. But if not, then we ought to simply get out of Vietnam. And that's what I think we ought to do, get out totally and completely. But the only way to determine this is to ask ourselves, how did we get in? What are the reasons? Are they valid? And what is the process of extrication from Vietnam? Well, where did it all begin? And how did we get into Vietnam? The roots of this affair go back to World War II itself. I first heard about Vietnam when I was a young intelligence officer on the staff of General Eisenhower. And we received a report from the Pacific Theater from the commanding General Douglas MacArthur. And if I may use the elegant literary style of Time magazine, no commie he. And what did Douglas MacArthur report to Dwight David Eisenhower? He said that there was a very brave man who was fighting for the independence of his country as an ally of the United States of America. And I know for the people, at least in this room, I need not give you even one guess as to the name of that brave man. And his name was Ho Chi Minh. And Douglas MacArthur sent him radio and electronic equipment and advisors so that he could report to us on Japanese troop movements and, how ironic it sounds now, so that he could rescue American pilots shut down over North Vietnam. That's where it all began, and it began with a man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who gave me much inspiration when I was a young man. Roosevelt promised freedom for subject peoples as a consequence of our battle for liberation in World War II. This message went all over the world. It was heard by such diverse men as the Sultan of Morocco, as Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia. It was heard by a then young prophet of an ancient people, David Ben-Gurion in Palestine. It was heard by Joseph Broz, known as Tito in Yugoslavia, and by Ho Chi Minh, who was living in the limestone caves of North Vietnam. And they fought with the promise of liberation. When the war was over and the Japanese were defeated, and the French were too weak to do anything about their former colonies, Ho Chi Minh arose in Hanoi in 1945 and proclaimed that his country was henceforth independent. And he read a Declaration of Independence. I think it's well for every American to note the words, the opening words of the Declaration of Independence of the Republic of Vietnam. They are these: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." It was the Declaration of Independence of the United States, translated into Vietnamese by Ho Chi Minh. Incidentally, which was very funny, when Ho Chi Minh determined to translate this, he wanted to get it exactly right, and he asked MacArthur's liaison officer to tell him what the exact words of the Declaration of Independence were. He didn't know. So they had to send back to the State Department, which didn't know either. So they went to the Library of Congress, got a copy of it, and Ho Chi Minh translated it. There were some people who said then, and who might say today, don't be taken in by that. That's just a cunning communist ruse. Well, perhaps it was. All I can say is that if Ho Chi Minh or anybody else wants to copy down the beautiful words of our Declaration of Independence and hold his hand out to us, I'm prepared to take that hand, ruse or not, and I'll look for the cunning later. The French were too weak in 1945 to do anything about it. And so they recognized Ho and Vietnam as a free country. This is very important for Americans to know. An election was held, and Ho was elected by 98%. Of course, there are those who will say, sure, that's the way elections are always held in communist countries. But I, who was in Vietnam at the time, and President Eisenhower himself, and every knowledgeable American will agree that this was a genuine vote. For Ho Chi Minh was, in the terms of those people, a kind of a communist George Washington. Now, I know that the notion of a communist George Washington rings strange in American ears, but any Englishman would understand it. George Washington, Ben Franklin, Tom Paine, they were rebellious fellows. They had long hair and weren't exactly clean. They were disobedient and they threw tea into Boston Harbor and other such reprehensible acts. Well, Ho Chi Minh was that sort of a fellow fighting for the independence of his country. And he was recognized. Now, it's important for Americans to know that he was recognized as the president of Vietnam. Not North Vietnam, Vietnam. There's only been this one country, Vietnam. South Vietnam is an invention of the government of the United States and the government of France as a satellite of imperial Western powers. One day it may be a reality, I don't know. That's up to the people of Vietnam to decide. That is not up to us to decide. So Ho became the president, and the French went to him with honeyed words, and they're very good at words, as you know, and said to him, why don't you come over to France and we'll work out a new arrangement between the former motherland and the ancient colony, a new relation called l'Union Française, a beautiful term, which the French adore because it's rhythmic, it's round, and it's empty, which is the way they and we like to conduct our foreign policy. So they invited Ho Chi Minh to Paris. That's where I first met him. That's where my wife first met him and became his hostess in Paris. That's how we got our visa to Vietnam many, many years later, by sending Ho Chi Minh a telegram saying, remember the young CBS correspondent at whose table you broke bread in Paris, you had dinner in our house, well, we're in Asia, we would like to come and break bread with you and have dinner in your house. And within 48 hours, we had a telegram from Ho Chi Minh inviting us to come and have dinner with him in his house, which we did. It was very difficult to have the dinner party because there were 10 American raids over the house that day. And all air raids are uncomfortable, but most particularly when it's the planes of your own country. But Ho Chi Minh came to Paris and soon discovered that the French version of a partnership of equals in a union was that since France was the strongest country, it ought to put its troops there to defend Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh said, against whom? French, it doesn't matter, we'll find somebody. Then the French said, since we are the strongest and the richest country, we'll be in charge of the economics of your country and the customs of your country. And Ho Chi Minh said, forget it. That's just another name for imperialism, and he left. In November of that year, 1946, the French sent an expeditionary force to Haiphong Harbor to take over the customs shed. There was a struggle. 2 French were killed. A couple of Vietnamese were killed. It was a minor conflict. But the French then drew up the French Navy, and this country of liberté, égalité, fraternité, elder sister of the church and cradle of Western civilization, opened up a barrage on a defenseless city and killed some 40,000 people in one afternoon. That's how the war in Vietnam first broke out. There's no argument about this. All historians agree. It was a war of a colonial peoples, the French, against the Vietnamese people led by Ho Chi Minh, communists, yes, that's really their business, but certainly an indigenous man fighting for his country. The French fought on with American help, which was a great disgrace. We abandoned our own tradition of anti-colonialism because we had become anti-communist. And so far as I am concerned, and I oppose communism, this is not a proper policy for the United States of America. Our country must be based on a positive inspiration to the peoples of the world as well as to ourselves. It is not good enough to be anti-communist. We must be, if we are Americans, pro-democratic. But we supported the colonial venture of the French, and it went on to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In those last terrible weeks of the colonial struggle, as the communist forces under Ho, the forces of national independence, were closing in around Dien Bien Phu, a man stood up in this country and said, if we have to send American troops in to save the day at Dien Bien Phu, then I say let's send them. That man was Vice President Richard Nixon. He said this in a speech the Association of Associated Press editors here in New York. So Mr. Nixon was the very first American on high level who proposed sending American troops in. He is the president now. I don't believe he's changed his views. That is why I have very serious doubts, which I will discuss with you in just a moment or two, about his plan for Vietnamization, which I believe to be a plan for continuing the war, not for ending the war, a plan against which we must fight even harder than we fought against the Johnson-Humphrey-Rusk policy. Mr. Nixon proposed we send troops in, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, a quite extraordinary man, said, no, I'll have nothing to do with it. When the president and spokesman of our country tell us that he is carrying out a policy laid down by all previous presidents, that is not true. It is a matter of historical record that Eisenhower refused to send American troops, and in the 8 years that he was president, he sent no American troops to Vietnam. He did send advisors, properly so, under the limits laid down by the Geneva Accords, but Eisenhower did not commit our nation to war in Vietnam. It is untrue to say so. It is a shame to the memory of Dwight Eisenhower to use his name in vain as it is being used. Eisenhower said no, the French sued for peace. And this peace was laid down in the Geneva Accords, the political accords of July 1954. I have been across this country to hundreds and hundreds of colleges and labor unions and chambers of commerce, and I have discovered that there isn't one American in 10,000 who has ever read the Geneva Accords. In Geneva, they set up a line at the 17th parallel. We now call it the demilitarized zone. This is the line on which our government bases its charge that there was a communist aggression because they crossed the line. I said that charge was a lie, and now let's pin that lie right to the wall at this moment. That line was described, and I quote from the Geneva Accords, as a temporary military demarcation line. Temporary, not permanent. Military, not civilian. Demarcation, not frontier. And just to be sure that nobody should misunderstand, the drafters of the Declaration went further and said, in no case shall this be considered a frontier. It did not separate two countries, North and South Vietnam. It temporarily divided one country into two zones. The word used in the Geneva Accord is zones, the zone of the North and the zone of the South, and that this line was to be removed by 1956 when general elections were to be held to reunify the single country of Vietnam. There was no South Vietnam in 1954. Those elections were not held. Why? Because a man named Ngo Dinh Diem was installed by the French and the Americans as the dictator of Saigon. He was not elected to office, he was installed. Who was he? A Catholic Mandarin who, to his credit, was a nationalist, who left his country for he would not further serve French imperialism. He was brought to this country by the Mary Knoll missionaries. He was brought up to Ossining, New York. He wasn't happy in Ossining. Who is? But he became a friend of that great expert on American foreign policy, Cardinal Spellman of the Archdiocese of New York. But still, he left, and he went to a Belgian monastery. And when disaster came in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and I was the only American in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, watching the end come, they looked around for somebody who was a nationalist who could possibly oppose Ho Chi Minh in the coming elections, and they said, let's get this nice little fellow who, after all, is a Christian. That'll appeal to John Foster Dulles, whom one diplomat in France referred to as the first card-carrying Christian of the Western world. And let's put Ngo Dinh Diem into power. And so they put Ngo Dinh Diem into power. His was a dictatorial regime, and he promptly stood up and said that he would not hold elections with the communists. He made this statement in July of 1955, just before a meeting of the Bizonal Electoral Commission. He said, you can't hold free elections with communists. That may or may not be true, but that ought to have been said in 1954 when the communists were asked to lay down their arms and to stop fighting. Now, the communists did lay down their arms, and they said that they would take their chances at the polls, but the free elections were not held. Why? Consult the memoirs of General Eisenhower, if you will. Certainly he, like MacArthur, is no communist or a communist sympathizer, and he says that he never met a knowledgeable expert in the field who ever doubted that Ho Chi Minh would win against Emperor Bao Dai by 80% of the vote. And so we didn't dare go to the polls because the other side would win. Apparently we Americans are in favor of free elections only on condition that our side will win. You might call that the Cook County syndrome in world affairs. The elections were not held. They picked up their guns in the South, not in the North, but in the South, and began a fight against the oppression, the police state of the Ngo Dinh Diem regime. And that is how the war began all over again. Clearly again, a colonialist war. But onto this colonialist war, a civil war had been grafted. And on top of the Civil War, a Cold War had been grafted. Those are the 3 C's of Vietnam. A colonial war, a civil war, a Cold War. And it had nothing to do with independence. It had nothing to do with freedom. It had nothing to do with democracy, for there was no freedom, no democracy in South Vietnam. They had Ngo Dinh Diem, who was assassinated. Then they had a whole series of people come in. Big Mean and Little Quat and medium-sized somebody else, until we ended up with the current rascals who are in power now, Q and Key. These men do not represent at all any freedom. The man who ran second to them in the elections held under their own bayonets, Lawyer Zhu, whose son David Truong honors us with his presence today, has been in jail ever since. More than 29 newspapers have been closed. They have concentration camps. Nobody knows how many people are living in those concentration camps. They're kept in power only by the United States of America, and they could not continue for even a few days' time if our force and our sons were not there. This is the terrible story of what happened in Vietnam. There's one other item that I should mention. Once in a while, you will still, even now today, hear that oft-repeated lie that we are in Vietnam under treaty commitments solemnly taken, the CETO Treaty. You heard the former Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, say this on Face the Nation. You've heard Mel Laird, and you've heard President Nixon in an address to the nation repeat it. Well, I mentioned earlier that 1 out of 10,000 Americans have read the Geneva Accords. I think 1 out of 100,000 have read the CETO Treaty. Don't feel bad about it if you haven't, because your president hasn't either. That's the nicest thing I can say about him, because if he read it, then he is a liar. For the CETO Treaty does not commit us to war in Vietnam. Now look here, don't believe me or your government, although of the two I am the more trustworthy. But read it for yourselves with your own good free American minds and find out. Read also the testimony at the Senate. I was present during the Senate debate. I heard John Sherman Cooper, Republican of Kentucky, a senior statesman of this country, turn to John Foster Dulles and say, if I ratify this treaty, will it commit the people of the United States to go to war in Vietnam? That's not a bad question. And John Foster Dulles replied, no, sir, it will not. Then Sherman Cooper, having been around for a very long time and a smart man, went on to ask another question. If I ratify this treaty, Mr. Secretary, will it commit this country to any action whatsoever? And John Foster Dulles replied, no, sir, it will not. This treaty is an obligation for consultation, not for action. So not only does it not commit us, we even broke the terms of the treaty, for we didn't consult anybody. We just went in. We began to go in with John F. Kennedy, who was cautious, who sent in about 15 to 18,000 advisors, but he called them advisors. Their necks were as thick as this, their lips moved when they read, but they were advisors. They were even armed advisors, but they were not troops and they were not committed. And John F. Kennedy, in his last interview before he died on CBS News, said, we can aid them, we can advise them, but in the final analysis, we cannot fight for them. They must fight for themselves if their freedoms are to be permanent and meaningful. That was the message of John F. Kennedy. So he did not commit us to this war either. Lyndon Johnson committed us to this war in 1965. He promised us that if we elected him, he would not send American boys 10,000 miles away. I remember recently at the University of Arizona in Tucson, a man came over to me and said, I don't know whether you remember me, Professor Schoenbrun, but we had a terrible fight in 1964. You said to me that if I vote for Goldwater, there's going to be defoliation and escalation and 500,000 American men will be sent. By God, you were right. I voted for Goldwater, and that's what happened. Now, Lyndon Johnson put us into this war against every promise he took, and Mr. Richard Nixon is keeping us in this war. I will say this for him, he'd made only one promise, and that he has not broken. He said he had a secret plan for peace. He still has a secret plan for peace. Now, he has put forward something called Vietnamization. What is that? Well, I read the fine print. I've learned to do that as a reporter. The fine print says that we will withdraw American ground units from Vietnam on 3 conditions. People forget the conditions when they talk about his peace plan. The conditions are if there will be progress at the Paris peace talks. I've covered those talks for 2 years. The only progress has been to agree on the size and shape of the table. That's all. And that's all that's going to happen in Paris, for the decisions must be taken in Washington, not in Paris. He also said if the level of hostilities goes down, in other words, if the other side agrees not to fight us, to let us win, he'll pull out. That's very nice of him, but that message is not likely to be heard by the adversary who's fighting for his own home. And finally, Mr. Nixon said he will pull out if, as, and when the South Vietnamese of Saigon demonstrate their ability to replace us. Don't hold your breath. Not only did they still not go on night patrol, not only have they still not made sufficient progress, but I think it's illogical to assume that they will make great progress, since they know that if they do, we will leave. And they would rather we didn't. They're enjoying our money. They're enjoying the blood of our boys being spilled for them. There's no reason why they should take over. But even if all of these marvelous conditions were to be worked out, Mr. Nixon has only promised us that he is going to pull out ground troops, because they can't use the sophisticated weaponry which we must leave. And, of course, if we leave artillery, we must also leave some ground troops to defend the artillery. That's Vietnamization. I submit to you that this is not a program for pulling out of the war, but continuing the war at a somewhat lower profile. A very hard-nosed fella in Washington told me the other day, it's very simple, Schoenbrun, if you want to understand it. We can't take 300 dead a week. We can take 150. That's the Nixon plan. To hold it down to 150 dead a week. Well, I can and you can take 150 dead, or even 1 dead a week, in a lost and ignoble cause. Hear, hear. Furthermore, I would like to say as an ex-soldier in the American Army that I am deeply offended by the inner meaning of Vietnamization. For what is the President in fact telling us? That the Army of Saigon, with American naval, air, and artillery support, can do what the Army of the United States, with American air, naval, and artillery support, could not do. That's an offensive statement. It's insulting. And I don't like to hear the Commander-in-Chief running down American soldiers by saying Saigonese soldiers can do better. There's one final inner meaning of Vietnamization, and this is a true meaning. Do you know what Vietnamization really means? The war in Vietnam is being extended to Vietnamize Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. That's the truth of Vietnamization. It is slopping over at the moment that we talk. American advisors this week for the first time have appeared in Cambodia with South Vietnamese units. We have interfered in Laos. We overthrew the original neutral coalition of Prince Suvarnabhumi and Prince Suvarnabhumi. It was a very neat agreement to have a coalition government to divide 2 halves of the country between 2 half-brothers. Logical enough. This was overthrown by the CIA, which decided to back a so-called strongman, Phumi Nusavan. I don't know why we Americans have such an affinity for strongmen. In any case, and they always turn out to be weak, he ended up, as most of them do, in Thailand with a big bank account en route to Geneva, Zurich, Lisbon, to join the past greats, the Fatty Farouks of the world, who generally end up in that part of the world. We have interfered with the CIA. When I first landed in Vientiane, I saw all these planes on the airport of Air America. There is no such company as Air America. It's a CIA front, the Air American company. We have 6 American airfields in Thailand, and when we talk about the Vietnamese infiltrating on Thailand, of course they are. Wouldn't you try to infiltrate and to create insecurity on a base where bombers are dropping on this little country many more bombs already than they dropped on Germany and Japan together in World War II. This is what is done in the name of America, and it's got to stop. I am outraged myself when I see people who are so driven out of their minds with anger that they'll burn their draft cards or burn the American flag. I think it's stupid. for it's symbolic of blowing up and burning our country. None of us wishes to do that. I don't want to burn the American flag, but I've got another ceremony that I invite every fellow American to join me in. Let's get together and wash the American flag. There are people who say to me, why do you keep your pressure on? Don't you see Nixon's trying to do something? Why don't you give Nixon a chance? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. I'd like to give Nixon a chance. He's not really my choice for president, but he is the president. Nothing would please me more than his success, for that means the success for our whole beloved country, and that's meaningful to all of us. I'd like to give Nixon a chance. But more than that, we must give a chance to the American boys who are dying in Vietnam. More than 5,000 have died. More than 20,000 have been wounded since Mr. Nixon has been president. Now that's enough of a chance, Mr. Nixon. You've had it. Now get out. There are those who say, well, Schoenbrun, you may be right, but it's very complicated. Just how are you going to get out? Well, there are two answers to that. One's a very short one. One's just a little bit longer. The short answer, of course, is on ships. That's the way you went in. But it requires a longer answer, but really not much longer than that. Let me time myself just to see if I can do it. You know, all these years on CBS, I've always been asked to analyze world news in depth in 90 seconds between an underarm deodorant and a post-nasal drip. Well, today, without benefit of deodorants or drips, I'll time myself and see if I can give you a speech that Mr. Nixon can give to the American people. A speech that I'm sure not only everybody in this room, but everybody who's going to be seeing this film, every American citizen, with few exceptions, there are always some, but I think the overwhelming majority of America would applaud the following very brief presidential address.
My fellow Americans, in the winter and spring of 1965, our government took a commitment in Vietnam. It is important to understand the nature of that commitment, what it was and what it was not. It was not a commitment permanently to defend Vietnam. It was a commitment to help the South Vietnamese organize themselves in their own defense. In fulfillment of that commitment, we have already sacrificed more than 40,000 of our men who have died there, some 275,000 who were wounded, and we've expended $150 billion of our treasury so badly needed here at home. At the same time, we have raised, trained, and equipped an army of 1 million South Vietnamese. Now it is their turn to carry out the defense of the country, and our commitment has ended. Our mission is honorably accomplished. We wish them good luck, and we say farewell.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've not come here to speak at you today, but to speak with you. And I invite your comments or your questions, and let him without sin ask the first question.
There are some who sincerely feel that if we withdraw too precipitously from South Vietnam, there will be a bloodbath against our friends. What would be your comment about this?
Yes, sir. I've heard that question many times. Interestingly enough, I used to hear it as CBS correspondent in France about Algeria. And we were told that if the French pulled out of Algeria, all of the Algerian Muslims who had collaborated with the French would therefore be subjected to a bloodbath. In fact, it did not happen. There was no bloodbath in Algeria. Now, I must be totally honest with you. This does not mean that there will not be a bloodbath in Southeast Asia. It is not proof in and of itself. It's a sign of what might happen. I do not believe that there will be a bloodbath. I have been in and out of Vietnam for 25 years. I think these are people who have an astonishing amount of humanity to them. They're cruel in war, but who is not? But they're basically, I think, are gentle people. After 25 years of war, I don't think that in the moment of victory that they'll wish to continue to kill themselves. Now, there may be a list, I would be surprised if there weren't, of some 3, 4, 5, maybe 10,000 men who are war criminals, who would be killed. Don't worry about them. They all have numbered bank accounts in Switzerland, and all of your tax dollars are deposited to their accounts, so they won't suffer. And finally, I must say this. I hope you won't think it cruel of me, but it's an honest answer. The worst bloodbath of all is war itself. And if we end it, and if we get out, and if they wish to continue the bloodbath, that is their choice. But I don't want any more Americans either to give their blood or to shed the blood of innocent people.
That if we were to remove ourselves from Vietnam, that it would create economic havoc here at home. What is your comment?
Well, sir, a lot of things one could say about that.
The real motivation was not economic, it was political. We went into Vietnam during the Cold War out of fear of what we believed to be a Sino-Soviet bloc. It didn't exist. We made a mistake. We've paid heavily for it.
The war has already created economic havoc here at home. Terrible havoc. And by the way, for the first time in a very long time, every time there's a peace rumor, Wall Street goes up. And every time there's an offensive, Wall Street goes down. So the money managers of our country apparently don't believe that that is true. I said earlier that we've expended almost $150 billion so far in this war. That's a lot of economic havoc. The cities of America, speaking through the vice president of the Mayor's Association 2 years ago, John Lindsay, asked for $10 billion a year for 10 years to rebuild the inner cities of America, and he was told that that was not realistic. Well, I ask you, my fellow Americans, is it realistic to spend over $100 billion to destroy the cities of Vietnam and not have $100 billion to build the cities of America? No, I think that's untrue. I know of no overriding economic interest that we have in Southeast Asia itself. Of course, we do have interest in accumulating raw materials, but that's not the chief motivating factor. What you may be referring to, sir, is those people who think that our economy cannot function without war. You may be referring to the fact that almost 1 out of every 4 or 5 Americans directly gets his income from the Department of Defense. But that is not written on tablets of stone. There are other ways we can arrange our economy to keep it healthy. I think America is capable of going ahead in great progress and economic prosperity without war. And I will finally say this. If we need war to maintain affluence, I would rather be poor.
Is there a large silent majority? And if there is, in a democracy, would it be advisable for the minority to try to come through and make some compromise, not a compromise, but something that we could do about ending the war quickly?
The majority, silent majority, of American colonists were loyal to the British Crown. A vocal minority fought for independence, and our country was made free. The silent majority of Americans supported the peculiar institution of slavery. A vocal minority of abolitionists demanded that slaves be set free, and so they were. Silent majorities have tolerated child labor, denied the vote to women, refused Social Security. In each case, a vocal minority demanded and obtained this human progress. Now, how does it happen in history that the silent majority accomplishes nothing and the vocal minority does anything that represents human progress? For the simple reason that the silent majority, being silent, is nothing. What matters are the number of decent human beings who are willing to stand up. that minority is the true majority of humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, may I say that it's been for me a very great pleasure, a very great privilege to speak with you today. So long as we can continue, even in time of war and crisis in this country of ours, to have free meetings, free discussions, and discourse of this kind, just so long will there be hope that one day the promise of America will match the performance of America. Thank you very much.